Okay. Well, welcome everyone to another Lunch and Learn. My name is Lily, and I serve here with Mennonite Central Committee as the Low German Program Networker. A number of people are joining us remotely, and thank you for joining us, and I hope this short delay hasn't inconvenienced you too much. Learning about Mennonites has certainly been a topic that our annual networking conference has addressed quite regularly, and I'm very glad that we are able to offer this here at our site. I am also very delighted to introduce Barb Draper. I first met Barb when she was an ESL teacher, teaching ESL for the Low German newcomers in Drayton, and that was the program that I was coordinating. So it was a lot of fun to interact with Barb and also learn from her. Since then, she has done all kinds of interesting things. She has written a family history book, and she's also written this book, The Mennonites of St. Jacobs and Elmira. She has also written a number of dramas that have been performed at her church, and one of them I will mention is What Shall We Do with the Family Farm? Currently, Barb is an editor, associate editor of the Canadian Mennonite. And I also want to say is that Barb has her family roots are within the Old Order community and also in the David Martin group. So she has a lot of family and personal experience with living and working with people of the diverse Mennonite group. So welcome, Barb, and thank you so much for being willing to do this presentation for us.
Hi. When I'm not totally sure what it is that Fred asked me to do, except to explain to you why there's so many different kinds of Mennonites and try to have some handle on how they're different from each other. And all I can do, I think, is sort of hit the high points. I can't really get into the weeds in all the different groups. So I'm going to try to just hit the high points, and hopefully in questions we can be more specific, if anything, if you're interested in anything more specific. And I wrote this book to try to help the Elmira and St. Jacobs community get a sense of what the differences are. I took 6 different Mennonite groups there and talked at great length. One of the other things that I did about a year ago when that CBC show came out, what was it called? Pure. And so at Canadian Mennonite, we decided that we should have 10 things to know about Mennonites in Canada. And it has received something over 30,000 different hits. So that was quite popular. So you might want to go have a look at that if what I say today doesn't make any sense. That will be even less in the weeds. So the first question of that 10 things question is, why are there so many different kinds of Mennonites? And I think just sort of generally I would say that Mennonites don't have a hierarchy in the church, that authority rests with either the congregation or a group of congregations. And there's a sense of egalitarianism, and so if somebody doesn't like what's being taught, they feel free to speak up. And sometimes when there's a lot of conflict within a group or within a congregation, splits happen, and they have happened a lot through history. Okay, so I'm looking at particularly Mennonites in Waterloo region, but I will mention others as well. The first Mennonites to come to Waterloo region were Swiss Mennonites. So Swiss Mennonites goes back to almost 500 years ago, begun in Zurich and then spreading through Switzerland. And there was a lot of persecution, and so these Mennonites began moving. There was sort of a second wave of persecution in the late 1500s and the early 1600s, and they began moving into southern Germany and into Alsace, which is now France, into the Palatinate after the 30 Years' War. So through the 1600s, they're moving, and then in the 1700s, they're moving to Pennsylvania. They lived in Pennsylvania, for example, my ancestors lived in Pennsylvania for 100 years, and then in the early 1800s came to Ontario. And you might know that the Joseph Schneider House, who happens to be my great-great-great-great-grandparents, came in 1805 to Waterloo Region. And you probably know from another presentation that this land is within 6 miles of the Grand River. And so this was part of the Haldimand Tract. And somebody named Richard Beasley bought most of what is now the cities of Kitchener-Waterloo. He tried to resell what he had, but there was issues over land title. And in the end, a group of Mennonites from Pennsylvania bought thousands of acres, much of what is now Kitchener-Waterloo, as a lump. They collected the money and bought it as a lump sum. And the government had sort of said, well, we don't know for sure who's got the authority to make the decision that this land can be sold, but if you pay the money up front, we'll let you buy it. And so the Mennonites bought it in a large chunk. They were so enthusiastic about it that they went on a couple years later to buy much of Woolwich Township. Woolwich Township, west of the Grand River, was also bought as a large chunk. Now, these Mennonites didn't necessarily all, they welcomed others to come and join them, and they owned the land individually. So it was not a colony. So lots of Mennonites moved from Pennsylvania here to Woolwich, to Waterloo Region, and became a very concentrated settlement. It wasn't long after that that the Amish started to come. By 1823, there were Amish living in Alsace who, well, partly, it's post-Napoleon, saying that right, am I not? Yeah. So there was a lot of unrest and social upheaval in Europe, and a lot of Amish moved into, when they came here, the land in sort of what's now Kitchener-Waterloo was all used up, but there was some good land just to the west between here and New Hamburg, and there was a settlement of Amish there. So the mid-1800s were a time of quite a bit of turmoil, partly, I think, because, well, the railroad came to Kitchener in 1856, I believe, and there was prosperity. A lot of other German-speaking people moved to the Kitchener area. And with it, they brought some new religious ideas. And I think of it as capital E evangelicalism. Often it was Methodists, or there were people that they called German Methodists who emphasized personal salvation and some experiences that Mennonites traditionally didn't hold. And consequently, there were some mid-century splits. And the Mennonites, some of them are pushing, can't the Mennonite church be a little bit more like the Methodists? Well, it just sort of, things weren't going very well. And in 1889 was a major split where the old order group split from the mainstream Mennonites. They happen to be in the more northerly parts of the region, so Woolwich Township. And so sometimes they called them Woolwichers, and they called them the uppers as opposed to the lowers, but of course they're speaking in a dialect of German, and so it wasn't uppers and lowers, it was Unre and Evre. And so we then had in Waterloo Region two major groups. The group that now is Mennonite Church Eastern Canada and the Old Order group. Now, what can I say about these? So the Old Orders have divided several times since 1889. The first division was in 1917 with the creation of the David Martin Mennonites, also called Independent Old Order Mennonites. And if you saw them, you wouldn't know the difference, but every time I'm in the grocery store in Elmira, I try to pick out, is that a Dave Martin or is that an Old Order? Because there are subtle differences, not as my parents could pick it out immediately, but I can't necessarily. There was also, in the mid-20th century, a split within the sort of mainstream Mennonite church and the creation of what I think of as capital C conservative Mennonites. And then we also have the car driving Old Orders, a division that occurred in 1939. The 1960 division with the conservatives, the issues were, I would say, fundamentalism and evangelicalism, where the Mennonite Church had moved and adopted a lot of fundamentalist ideas. By the mid-20th century, they're sort of, with Harold Bender, they're moving back into a sort of, the theology was changing with the creation of a conservative church. The Old Orders have separated several times. The issue often is how separate do they want to be from the world and how isolated? So that the Dave Martin or independent Old Order group are more isolated, although they send their children to public schools. The Old Orders began, they had sent their children to public schools until the mid-60s when they started having separate schools or parochial schools. This group, I call them capital C conservative because it includes a variety of different groups, but the biggest one in Waterloo Region would be Midwest Fellowship. These people tend to be fairly fundamentalist and also quite evangelical, so that they will have some overseas missions, but they also have a separatist flavor to them. And of course, probably, if you attend a Mennonite church, you're probably part of Mennonite Church Eastern Canada, which is, and I would say that the Mennonite Church Eastern Canada in its history since 1889 has probably not divided as much as the Old Orders have. So I want to just say something also about Russian Mennonites. This is a totally different stream of Mennonites. The connections over the centuries have been there, but they've not been very strong. It's fairly loose and just occasional. In the 1500s, began in Flanders and Friesland, so very much the roots are in the Netherlands. And in the 1600s, I think 1600s, 1700s, they're moving to Prussia, which is now Poland. And they were tending to move eastward while the Swiss Mennonites were moving westward. And then in the late 1700s, very early 1800s, they moved to the Ukraine, where they lived in independent colonies. Again, they owned areas of land, but they tended to live in colonies, and they were not as land ownership was a little different than the Swiss Mennonites, and they had this. They ran their own civil affairs and educational affairs. In the 1870s, some of these Mennonites moved to Manitoba. And the issues there were issues like the Russian government was moving toward more Russification, making its citizens more Russian rather than allowing them to be multicultural, I guess. And the ones who remained in Ukraine were very much influenced by what happened in the early 20th century with the Russian Revolution and its following with famine, warfare, and collectivization of farms. In the 1920s, some of them were able to leave and come to Canada. So 1923, some of them came here to Waterloo Region. So when they came into Canada in the 1920s, they had you'd think, well, these are Mennonites, why don't they just sort of join the Mennonite churches that are already here in Waterloo Region? Well, it's not that simple. First of all, their language is different. Both of them speak German at home, but it's not the same kind of German. They're dialects, certainly for the Swiss Mennonites, they're dialects. And so their culture is very different. And so they tended to establish their own churches of two kinds. Mennonite Brethren and General Conference. So, and we still have, and what happened eventually over the years is that these two groups joined up together to form Mennonite Church Eastern Canada. So you had, the Mennonite Brethren had their own churches, and it's hard to know what to call the other group because they, of course, used a German word, which doesn't translate easily into English. Then in the 1920s, there was also a group from Manitoba who moved to Mexico for a while because they wanted to run their own education systems. And then by the 1950s and 60s and 70s, they're coming to Ontario and coming to Waterloo Region. I don't know when the earliest ones were, but they came, I would say, probably didn't come in large numbers till about the 1980s. And there's a 1988 to get together and to form Mennonite Church Eastern Canada. But then you have all those other little subgroups and small subdivisions. Some of them are more integrated. Some of them are quite separate. And it's all very complex and confusing. So I'm sorry, I feel as though I haven't done a very good job of even hitting the high points. I'd like to go to questions, may I? Yeah.
Where did the Mark of Mennonites fit into this history?
So the question is the Mark of Mennonites. And who are the Mark of Mennonites? I know a bit about that because that's the church I grew up in. Or I'm assuming we're talking about the same Mark of Mennonites. So when Mennonites first came here in the early 1800s, there were three communities. There was here, Waterloo region, there was a community in Markham, and there was a community in the Niagara region, with the biggest group around Vineland. In 1889, when the Old Order split happened, it happened in all three regions. But the Old Order region group in Niagara probably didn't last beyond, the early 1900s. The group in Markham lasted quite a bit longer. And then in 1939, when the local Old Order church had a big dispute, and it's I don't want to get into the details of everything that happened, because every split has its own long story. But the issues essentially were that there was a bishop that wasn't in good standing with his fellow ministers, and there were people who were pushing to have cars. And so there was a split in 1939, and the ones who wanted to have cars, in fact, they'd been going down to the Old Order group in Markham to have communion for about 10 years. And so when they separated from the Old Orders, they joined with the group in Markham. So we call them Markham Mennonites. That's what you were asking, right? Okay, and so they live side by side with everybody else between here and Mount Forest. When I was there as a teenager, they had 5 churches. Now they have, I don't know, probably at least 10, maybe more. They use cars. They tend to be black. And like all Old Order groups, they're very traditional. They don't ask a lot of questions. And so change happens much more slowly for them. I'm not sure what time it is. Can somebody tell me when we have to be done? It's 12:29? Okay. Yeah.
You mentioned that there are similarities between Old and Old Colony. Could you talk a little bit about what those similarities are?
So the question is about similarities between Old Order Mennonites and Old Colony Mennonites. In many, like what happened to the Amish over the years, they have the same kind of splits they're part of the Swiss Mennonites. They're just, I think I forgot to say that it's in the late 1600s that you have this Amish division in Europe already. So when they come to North America, there's Amish and there's Mennonite, although there's a lot of similarities. So the Amish have their own split, so that there's Beachy Amish and there's conservative Amish. And the splits are around the same time and over the same kinds of issues. The 1950s brought a lot of change to our congregations in MCEC. And there were people who said, hey, wait a minute, this isn't right. And so there are also, for me, this is the most difficult one to wrap my head around. Who are these people? And they keep changing things and adopting new names and switching, and so that there's nationwide fellowship, there's Midwest fellowship, which I mentioned because they're the biggest. Now, I believe Christian Aid Ministries comes out of one of those groups. I'm not sure whether they're Amish or whether they're regular Swiss Mennonite. But it is, my understanding is that Christian Aid Ministries is sort of, Mennonites tend to either support Mennonite Central Committee or Christian Aid Ministries. And so it's sort of, and they get a lot of support. They do a lot of work. And I would say that the churches that support Christian Aid ministries probably tend to be just a little bit more capital E, evangelical, and maybe fundamentalist. Does that help? I think that the roots of it come from the US, and the US had the same kind of, spectrum. But I'm not sure exactly where it started, but certainly when it comes to support. So who in Waterloo Region, for example, would support Christian Aid ministries? These people, yes. The Markham and Old Order, it's hard for me to say. I think that they tend to support both MCC and Christian Aid ministries. They have a lot of respect for Christian Aid ministries, but they also respect MCC. And I should say that Mennonite Central Committee, in many ways, grew out of the Russian Mennonites coming to Canada in the 1920s. They didn't only come to Canada, but it was a response to Mennonites who were suffering in Ukraine that caused the creation of Mennonite Central Committee. And it's called Central Committee because somebody said, for heaven's sakes, let's not have a million different groups, let's work together. We can work together more efficiently. So MCC then is also very helpful in the Second World War in bringing different Mennonite groups together to deal with the whole question about whether conscription would mean, like how to avoid going to war for Mennonites who don't believe that that's the right thing to do. And MCC was very helpful for that. And one of the reasons why there's been ongoing support, I believe. So that my brother served on the MCC Ontario board for, I don't know, umpteen years. But I'm not aware that they have a follow, yeah, do they still? Does MCC Ontario have somebody from the Old Order? No, they wouldn't, the Old Order, but the Markham group?
Yeah, we've got work.
Oh, okay, all right. I was looking and I guess I just didn't, maybe I didn't know. Is it time to stop?
Thank you very, very much, Barb, for giving us this background about Mennonites. And I think it's helpful. I learned a few things from the Swiss Mennonite side that
Okay.
I didn't know. So thank you so much. And I'm sure all of us gained a deeper understanding about Mennonites. And for those of you who are also online, thank you for your participation. And this session has been recorded and will be available on one of the YouTube channels. So thanks for coming.